On this topic of protecting democracy, some critics of proportional representation have the concern that under these systems, smaller parties, fringe parties, or even extremist parties might have a disproportionate amount of power. How would you respond to those kind of concerns?
Yeah, well, I would say that we have some fairly fringe politics happening right now under first past the post south of us. Your electoral system is not the driving force of whether you get extremist views or fringe parties emerging. The single greatest, in terms of historically, and I used to teach this to my students, a factor in the rise of extremist thinking is inequality. And when you look at inequality and also the lack of capacity for social movement in countries, it's the US and the UK are at the very top of that spectrum in terms of it's getting harder and harder for social movement to happen within those countries. We and the US and the UK are really the last three major holdouts in first past the post in a world where 85% of OECD countries operate under proportional representation. And so in those countries, what you see is more women elected to parliament, you see more diversity, you see higher markers in terms of voter turnout, in terms of participation in democracy. We, as I said earlier, our shared values in BC are really what are going to be the driving force of politics under a proportional system. The polarization under a first past the post, which pushes parties to try to identify themselves more and more by what their differences are, that is actually more worrying to me than minority governments and proportional systems where we start to work on our shared values. One small example out of New Zealand where there was an anti-immigration party, and when they were engaged in conversation, and they got a small number of votes and a small number of seats, and they don't become a driving force of policy, but when they were engaged in conversations about why do you hold these views, why are you afraid of immigration, the reality was that it was rooted in the fact that they were afraid of the loss of jobs for New Zealanders. And when policies were brought in that addressed those fears, then those extremist views dissipated. And they started to realize that immigration was not the driving cause of the lack of jobs, that we have policies that can ensure that we can address those problems. So in some ways, making these views part of a participatory democracy, but I'm not worried about extremist views in BC. And the final thing that's really important is there's a 5% threshold that was introduced with the recommendations, which would mean that no party would get seats with less than 5% of the vote. What I do like about the systems that have been brought in is that because there's the first past the post, right, independents can be elected.
Yes.
So somebody like Vicky Huntington, who was a very popular representative for her riding, under this kind of these systems being proposed, she would still very much have the chance to be elected. Yep. And I think that that's an important piece to remember. But in terms of extremism exists under first past the post, and this is not a harbinger of that kind of thing. We actually, it creates far more consensus and shared values.
And if you are successful, if the Yes campaign is successful and we move to proportional system, what is the post-referendum process going to look like? Do you have any concerns about it?
Yeah. So the post-referendum, there's really two major pieces of that. One is that there will be an all-party legislative committee, which will hold committee meetings, which will be public. They will invite experts, and they will sort of fill in the final details of the system, whichever system is chosen by the electorate. The second piece is the Electoral Boundaries Commission, which will determine, as they do after every second election in BC anyways, the Electoral Boundaries Commission will determine the boundaries of the ridings as determined by the system that's been chosen. I think this is a great post-referendum process. I think it's very exciting to have that conversation ongoing. And then finally, the recommendations would go back to the legislature and they would be voted on there.